One anonymous phone call to Crime Stoppers, that's all it's going to take. And we will pay you £50,000 for that information, which leads to the arrest of Cregan and Wilkinson.
I really needed the public's help in telling me where they were because the risk to them was great.
Britain's most wanted man, murder suspect Raoul Moat.
He says he won't be taken alive. The stakes in this search have never been higher.
Just an absolutely despicable act, one of pure evil.
I've never come across anybody who could be so callous and so cold.
We had grenades, which had not happened before in that sort of attack.
This was the first time that 2 female police officers had been killed on duty in mainland Britain.
If you're feeling numb, you're feeling shocked, you're feeling anger, you name it, every emotion you could think of is going through your head.
We're just ordinary people. We are just ordinary people.
Dale Cregan was born in Tameside, Greater Manchester, in 1983. His life of crime started at an early age, when he apparently began dealing cannabis while he was still at school. By the time he reached his early 20s, he allegedly developed a strong interest in weapons, particularly knives, and was earning large amounts of money from dealing cocaine.
Having spoken to a number of people that knew Cregan as he was growing up, I think it is fair to say that signs were there that this was an individual that was going off the rails.
Cregan built a reputation in his community through intimidation. With a distinct appearance, he bragged about losing one of his eyes in a street fight.
There were some pretty horrendous acts of violence that he had engaged in, not using firearms, but using other weapons, which to ordinary human beings would be absolutely abhorrent and unthinkable, which gives you an indication of the kind of mind and individual that we were dealing with.
Cregan moved to a town called Droylsden in Greater Manchester and straight onto the turf of local gang leader David Short. Before long, tensions brewed as Cregan allegedly became an enforcer for a rival family, the Atkinsons. A turf war began which saw unprecedented levels of violence, including people being shot at, run over and stabbed. A dangerous feud that ultimately became deadly in 2012.
He started off from a dispute between 2 families, but a dispute which had a long history of animosity as well. Often, perhaps, the public isn't fully aware of how actually a lot of crime is generated by crime groups who create the market in stolen goods, create the market in drugs, who get involved in all forms of illegal activity. Power bases, through their threats, through their intimidation, through their reputation, will try and rule areas, intimidate areas, and almost try and create an alternative economy and an alternative, almost criminal justice system.
The violent history between the 2 families had allegedly ended in a truce in 2003, but 9 years later erupted once more.
It started from a dispute over a woman and an argument over a woman.
If somebody had made an advance towards somebody, that person had not taken them up on that particular offer, that was seen as disrespect. And we do believe that she allegedly had said she was going to get the boys to sort this out.
12 days later, on the 25th of May, this argument led to a fatal outcome. 23-year-old Mark Short was at the Cotton Tree pub in Droylsden, Manchester, with his friends and family. Just before closing time, a masked gunman entered the pub. Mark Short and his friends were targeted with a hail of bullets.
I remember quite distinctly it had been a long day and I'd driven home and I'd literally arrived home when the phone rang to say that there'd been a murder.
I think the gunman was in and out of the pub in under a minute. It was around 24 seconds. Mark Short was shot in the chest. 3 other people were shot in that pub. And by chance, David Short was in the toilet at the time the gunman came into the pub. He came out to find a scene of absolute devastation, and Mark Short died there in his arms.
The murder had clearly been seen by a number of other customers in the pub, but they refused to talk to the police.
because they're talking about people that were in criminal associations that were largely the witnesses who did not want to speak to the police, where clearly steps had been taken to obviously cover the tracks of those who had committed the attack, and that it was a very, very difficult investigation.
Rumours also began to circulate that Mark Short had been killed by accident and that the murderer was looking for someone else. With some witnesses to the crime potentially aiding the suspect, the police could not rely on their statements. So they turned to evidence and a call from a member of the public.
First of all, we had on CCTV the vehicle that was used in the Cotton Tree murder, and that was caught on CCTV. That was abandoned and burnt out some distance away. But there was clothing that was left near the area of that vehicle being abandoned, and we had information that that clothing had been dumped. We didn't know at that time, and nor did the person that called us, that was the clothing that had been used by the offenders in this particular case. But it was from that clothing that we were able to pick up some of the DNA traces that led us ultimately to Cregan and his associates. Well, what we understand is that there is a long-standing feud between the Shorts and the Atkinsons. And actually Cregan was part of, we believe, part of Atkinson's. He was hired muscle, if you like, for the Atkinson family. I suppose we will never know the truth. If that is right, to think that that was the start of a chain of events that led to the murders of 2 police officers, I think it is it's a sad indictment on society.
The way these things work is that often, the people clearly who are tasked with carrying out the violent attack have not been, originally directly involved in that first incident which showed the disrespect. And that's obviously one, a means of distancing the people who've commissioned the attack from those who actually carry out the attack. And that's often, again, what makes these sorts of investigations quite difficult.
Rumours of Dale Cregan working for the Atkinson family had been in the community for a while. But despite having a reputation as an enforcer, he wasn't known for this level of violence.
I think, to be fair, in my service in the police, you can see these people that engage in low to moderate level violence. And I think, to be fair, there comes a tipping point where they will then engage in something that takes them over the edge, where actually it's easier to carry on than it is to try and come back. Well, Cregan was known to the police anyway. He has a long criminal history, so he was well known to us.
It was not top of the pile, so there was quite a lot of intelligence about him, and clearly these 2 families were very well known about, but on the whole, it wasn't particularly active or particularly high on the radar.
Police studied the material they now had in an attempt to link Cregan to the attack. After the shooting, he had quickly left the country. But on his return to the UK, officers were waiting to arrest him. They finally had a key suspect in custody, but believed other people had also helped in the crime. Investigations continued into at least 4 other men known to Cregan.
We were always very worried that there could be further attacks. The sort of challenges we had was clearly, number one, finding the people responsible, people who are highly skilled in covering their tracks, who will have a wide web of associates who will protect them. We then had a huge number of people who were potentially at threat, because we didn't know who next within the criminal associations would then be targeted. So there was an enormously difficult situation of literally hundreds of people on both sides of this dispute who are now at risk, who had to be warned about their risk, and in certain situations had to be protected.
What had begun as a small-scale dispute between 2 families had turned into one of Greater Manchester Police's largest investigations. And Cregan, one of their main suspects, was about to become a free man.
We couldn't at that point get sufficient evidence together, which would have then enabled the Crown Prosecution Service to have then charged them. And that is why they were then let out on bail. And that is, whether we like it or not, a common occurrence.
A young father's death increased tension in the community, but officers had to release Dale Cregan from police custody without charge. However, their investigation into 2 other associates of his led to their arrests. 27-year-old Luke Livesey from Hattersley and 38-year-old Damien Gorman from Glossop were charged with the murder of Mark Short and 3 attempted murders on his friends. Police believed they finally had their suspects in custody, until another gruesome attack occurred. On the 10th of August, the father of the murdered man, 46-year-old David Short, was outside his house in Clayton, Greater Manchester.
10 weeks after the attack on the pub, David Short was unloading some furniture from his car when he was shot at 10 times with a Glock pistol and a military M75 hand grenade. A Yugoslavian military hand grenade was used against him. And after the autopsy, a report revealed that it caused such severe tissue damage that there was just no way he would have ever survived those injuries.
The series of incidents were shocking in terms of, the level of violence which was used. The fact that we had grenades used, which had not happened before in that sort of attack, really in the British mainland in that way. That said, organised crime groups are about using extremes of violence. That's how serious criminals rule the roost. The use of grenades created huge challenges for us in terms of how our firearms officers were then going to be able to capture somebody who potentially was able to use that type of weaponry.
And I remember vividly seeing an image afterwards of a van that was used in that attack. The side of the van, the roof, was absolutely peppered with holes from the shrapnel of one of these military hand grenades. So anybody anywhere near one of them would have stood absolutely no chance. But that image of that van sticks in my head, and I think at that point I realised just how dangerous this man was.
Once the second murder occurred, we then realised that we had some significant issues that we had to deal with very, very quickly.
Well, David Short survived the attack on the pub in which Mark Short was killed. Greater Manchester Police then issued 3 threat-to-life warnings to David Short, and they clearly believed that his life was in grave danger. That isn't something that's taken lightly, but on 3 occasions they told David Short that they believed there was a credible threat to his life.
Sadly, we are not unfamiliar with gangland type murders, and often with these murders it is gang members shooting each other using traditional or conventional firearms. The difference with this one was the use of hand grenades.
The use of military grenades was not something the force had seen before, and wasn't a readily available weapon. In just weeks, a father and son had been murdered in cold blood. As police built the evidence from this crime scene and pieced it together with intelligence from Mark Short's murder, certain suspects' names were prominent again, one being Dale Cregan.
In terms of how we got him and linked him to these offences, it was through forensics. First of all, how we actually got the link there. But secondly, there was an incident moments after he'd murdered David Short. Literally moments after, he went to an address in Luke Road and was caught on CCTV with, we believe, the firearm that he used to kill David Short. And the CCTV footage also caught him taking the pin out of the grenade and throwing it at an address in Luke Road.
What started off as this, supposed disrespect for a woman, then had escalated, to people being shot in the pub, and then to grenades being used. It was an extremely unusual and clearly violent event.
Before police could arrest Cregan, he fled and went into hiding, sparking an urgent nationwide hunt. It was clear that this dangerous man had a large network of people working with him and willing to protect his whereabouts. One of these people was an associate called Anthony Wilkinson, who had disappeared at the same time.
It was a very complex investigation because we now had somebody that we knew was on the loose. We knew that he was capable of using hand grenades, which had never been seen before in mainland UK. He was not afraid to kill, murder, maim.
sort of challenges we had was clearly, number one, finding the people responsible, people who, again, are highly skilled in covering their tracks, who will have a wide web of associates who will protect them and find them accommodation and move them to other parts of the country, whatever it might be. People who are extremely aware of the tactics that we use and extremely skilled in trying to frustrate them.
With advice from the military, we knew that they had a kill range of 50 metres and a maiming range of 100 metres. Potentially, we still had these hand grenades possibly in Cregan's possession, and we'd seen the level of violence that he was prepared to use. My fear was you throw one of these grenades into a public house, into a nightclub, into a police carrier, you have killed everybody. It was the level of weaponry that was now available and on the streets of Manchester, which was frightening, and I have to say, kept me awake at night.
Cregan at that point was identified as a national threat, but in terms of getting national coverage, part of the challenge we had was that at that time it was the Olympics, so all the media focus was on the Olympics, quite understandably.
I think it's fair to say that Cregan was quite savvy, but he was being supported by even more savvy criminal individuals. And so some of the techniques that he was using to avoid detection, so for example, using phones once and throwing that phone away and buying another phone, communicating through different channels, whether it's through games consoles or whatever, he employed a number of techniques and was advised by others using those various techniques that made it very, very difficult for us to actually track where he was or where he was going to be.
Officers believed Cregan and Wilkinson could be on the run together. Suspecting that they could be responsible for 2 murders and had the use of such destructive weapons, the police came up with an unprecedented tactic to try to catch them.
At the time in 2012, it was, of course, the London Olympics. They were dominating the news agenda, but certainly locally in the northwest, there was a growing concern and attention that there was clearly a very dangerous man here, and I think it became increasingly clear, certainly over the course of that August, that police were particularly keen to track him down and take him into custody.
The first reward discussed was £25,000. I recognised pretty quickly that £25,000 would not be enough to surrender this individual, I think mainly because of the fear that was in the community. The reward was actually up to £50,000. I remember having the conversation saying, you're going to have to do something which is unprecedented too in terms of reward. This is going to have to be life-changing. Let's say it's £1 million. Because I remember my officers coming in and saying that they were taking down posters in and around the Droylsden area saying that if you grass to the police, you will not live long enough to spend £50,000. The posters that were being put up was indicative of the kind of fear that existed within that community, so we had to do something which was pretty unique.
Well, a reward in this country is rare, but this was particularly rare in that it was being offered not for the conviction of Dale Cregan, but merely for his arrest. And it was also only to be given to somebody who called Crime Stoppers with information that, of course, led to the arrest of Dale Cregan. So it was very clear very quickly that police were very keen to track him down and to take Dale Cregan into custody.
£50,000 was eventually agreed, in the hope that somebody would lead officers to Cregan and Wilkinson's whereabouts, and time was running out.
With little information still coming forward, they took the extraordinary step of putting on display £50,000 cash, their biggest ever reward.
One anonymous phone call to Crime Stoppers, that's all it's going to take, and we will pay you £50,000 for that information, which leads to the arrest of Cregan and Wilkinson.
Now the threat had escalated to an incredible proportion that we had over 100 people that we considered now to be at risk because of the links with these gangs. Over 100 people that we considered were going to be the next target.
Because of the high risk to the public, police struggled to protect the sheer number of people who could potentially become the killer's next victim. And despite the substantial reward, the local community remained silent. Cregan and Wilkinson were nowhere to be found, but there was a breakthrough. Another suspect, 24-year-old Jermaine Ward, was arrested and charged with David Short's murder. However, police were confident that he hadn't acted alone and needed to find the other dangerous men quickly.
There was a lot of pressure put on various associates, family members. Clearly there was a huge number of rumours circulating. There was material on social media. Even to this day, there are people who will tell you that they knew where he was. We know that's untrue. It does show clearly that if you are determined to evade the police, if you are pretty skilled in some of those evasion techniques because of your previous criminal history, because of what you've been able to pick up about police tactics each time when you were arrested and convicted, because material is disclosed to you in the court process, then clearly that is an enormous challenge for policing and for law enforcement in general. Clearly we've examined a lot of our tactics since.
You couldn't go into Manchester city centre without seeing Dale Cregan's image, so his image was plastered across billboards. I remember vans with screens were being driven around with that appeal for information and Dale Cregan's very distinct image on these posters.
Despite a national appeal, a hunt involving many police forces in the UK and a reward for tens of thousands of pounds, weeks went by with no leads on Cregan or his associate Anthony Wilkinson.
He was on the run with Anthony Wilkinson. We knew that he had a number of people that had assisted him in the preparation of this crime and committing crimes, and so we had all of those individuals that we were looking for as well.
The search for both men stretched across the UK and Europe, but they still evaded capture. Until 3 weeks after David Short's murder, one man finally surrendered.
It was fair to say that after Anthony Wilkinson surrendered himself to custody, that Cregan was the main player. He was the one that we feared would create the most problems for the communities and would create most problems for us.
We've been under huge pressure. It was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We put into place a number of measures in terms of trying to, quantify the risk. We had a lot more armed officers. We had armed officers from other parts of the country. But what we clearly couldn't do is just abandon normal policing.
5 weeks after Dale Cregan had gone missing, Greater Manchester Emergency Services received a phone call from a member of the public complaining about damage to his property.
Someone just threw a big concrete slab through my back window now.
Were you in the room where it came through, or did you hear the bang?
No, I was upstairs. I looked out the window and seen one boy running out.
Is it a kitchen window that's gone through?
Yeah, kitchen.
Local police constables Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes were asked to go to the caller's aid.
They'll try and get up there as soon as, if there's a possibility, he's still knocking about.
All right then, thanks very much.
Okay.
I'll wait. I'll be waiting.
With the hindsight of knowing what that call was, it's incredibly chilling to know that was a man luring police officers to their deaths. He knew exactly what he was doing. Those police officers couldn't have had any idea of the danger that they were about to put themselves into, but the end of that call was absolutely chilling.
The two young officers drove just 3 miles from Hyde Police Station to the address in Hattersley.
So 10 o'clock, I was sat in the room, chairing the meeting, and we were discussing just various things around police in the division, and there was no knock on the door just literally burst open, and one of the detectives from the CID, or from the investigative teams within Tameside, was stood at the door, and he just said, "Boss, you better come out, there's something happening at Hyde." And he didn't really know what it was, and I didn't know what it was, but you could see that there was something significant. Who was saying, "I think it's something to do with Cregan." And I turned the radio on, hoping that this was just real positive news. I mean, in my mind, I was thinking this is good news, that we've caught him, or he's handed himself in, or whatever. The police radio took just a few seconds to fire into life, and as it did, the words that came over the radio, I'll never forget. And it was one of the sergeants who was saying, they're shot, they're shot, get an ambulance, get an ambulance. And I remember thinking, that just doesn't make sense. And the radio came on, I heard the radio operator at the same time trying to call a call sign of Golf Mike 41, Golf Mike 41, which was Nicola and Fiona's call sign. Because the call taker had obviously realised that those officers had gone to an address in that area, but I don't think had made the link at that point, and I certainly hadn't made the link.
The police operator got no response from the two officers.
And I remember saying to the sergeant, what's going on? And he just said, she's dead, she's dead. And I remember trying to speak to him and saying, who's dead? And the phone went off. And I rang the phone back immediately, and it was the inspector this time that answered the phone. And he said, Fiona's dead. And we're working on Nicola now. Cregan opened the door and immediately began firing this Glock 9mm weapon at Fiona and Nicola. No words were exchanged, he just simply started firing with this extended magazine on this weapon.
Fiona tried to use her taser gun to stop Cregan, but neither woman stood a chance. Despite colleagues rushing to help, Fiona lost her life at the scene, whilst colleagues desperately tried to save Nicola. Before the help arrived, the perpetrator fled the scene, leaving the victims to die.
We've then got Cregan, who'd driven to Hyde police station and had handed himself in. Did he have hand grenades on him? Was that police station now going to get blown up with hand grenades? Was the vehicle that he was in, was that booby-trapped with these grenades? Did he still have the weapon on him?
As an officer rushed to arrest the murderer, the enormity of the situation was taking hold.
I've got one officer that an inspector is telling me is dead. I've got another officer that they're saying is working on, that was Nicola. What did working on mean? It seemed I was just stood there forever, and almost as if I was looking down on the situation. And I feel in a way quite annoyed at myself about that, because you would think that you would know what to do. But I've said this many a time, we're just ordinary people. We are just ordinary people.
I was driving home and then a phone call came up and it was an unknown number on my hands-free in the car. And it was this, a DCI from Manchester. And he said, I need to speak to you. And then I could sense in his voice there was something, and I said, why, what's happening? He says, where are you? I said, I'm driving home from work. I'd seen Nicola the night before, and I thought she said to me, I'm off for 5 days now. But she said, I'm on for 5 days. Obviously, I'm Mercedes. He said, where are you? I'll come and get you, I'll come and get you. And he said, you know, there's no easy way of saying it. And he didn't actually say the words, but he just said there's no easy way of saying it. And then the next, 2 or 3 miles were, I don't know, a blur, a nightmare.
23-year-old Nicola Hughes lost her life in hospital, despite desperate attempts to save her.
Nicola and Fiona were available to take the call because they were on duty that day. They took the call and because of it, they lost their lives.
As Nicola's family tried to process the devastating news, police rushed to contact Fiona's parents, 150 miles away on the Isle of Man.
We were sitting having lunch and we put the news on, and the headlines were 2 police women had been killed in Manchester. And fairly vague, but hey, Fiona's police woman in Manchester. Oh, should I give her a ring, should I not? And then there was a knock on the door. And that was it. So I opened the door to a police sergeant and a nice young police lady and said, "You may as well come in then." Because we knew what it was about as soon as they knocked on the door. It was literally seconds of pre-warning. It really wasn't long. We were obviously fairly shocked, but I mean, their faces were quite, this is not the news we wish to bring.
We'd called all of the team back in off the streets, and they were all sat in the canteen at Ashton Police Station. And we walked into the canteen, and they were all sat there. And as you can imagine, you could have heard a pin drop. And we had to obviously give the news and the devastation that created. That they just then to be informed that they'd lost 2 of their colleagues on, what had been just a call to a routine burglary or damage. Just the level of grief in that room was palpable. And then, of course, you've got to offer them the support. Clearly, they couldn't go back onto the streets.
Gradually, the horrific news started to make the headlines across the country, as everyone tried to absorb the magnitude of what had happened.
This morning, a week after the sad deaths of Nicola and Fiona, we held a vigil close to the place where they were attacked. It was great to see so many colleagues attend, but also particularly so many ordinary members of the public of the communities of Hattersley and Mottram.
I think it absolutely horrified the nation, because this was the story of 2 young female police officers who were unarmed. They attended what they believed was a routine call-out, and because of it, they lost their lives.
It's difficult to describe how you feel. Obviously, if you're feeling numb, you're feeling shocked, you're feeling anger, you name it, every emotion you could think of is going through your head. I think she's so easygoing. I think that was one of the massive qualities, that she was really easygoing. She was so wise, she was intelligent, witty.
She moved to Manchester, where she became a special. And she enjoyed being a special 3 or 4 nights a week, or whatever it was she did. And she really liked it. So from the special, she tried joining the police force, and eventually she did. She liked it. Anything that was a bit risky, dodgy, or could upset anyone wasn't told to us. We only got to hear the good bits.
As the country was left reeling from the multiple murders, Fiona and Nicola's colleagues still had the burden of investigating the crime and piecing together Cregan's movements before the attack. And what came to light was more chilling than they expected.
Cregan held these people hostage with threat of murdering them and blowing up the daughter and all the rest of it. He allowed the occupant to go to work that morning, but had threatened to kill his partner and child if he had called the police. Cregan reportedly had said he was sorry that it was women and he wished it had been men. I want to make the point that Cregan saw those officers walking towards that address and had a number of opportunities not to engage with those officers. And if you look at Nicola, who was 23 at the time, who just looks like a child, and Fiona, who was 5'0", you could see that these were 2 individuals that actually were not going to pose much of a threat to him in any case. So this business about wishing that it had been men is nonsense.
If it hadn't been Nicola and Fiona, it'd have been somebody else. Nicola wasn't normally crewed with Fiona, so that was purely random. And it was just bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time.
The loss of both women brought the country to a standstill.
Another reminder of the incredible risks and the great work our police service does, and my thoughts, and I think the thoughts of the whole country, will be with their families at this impossibly difficult time.
Do you expect your children to plan your funeral? You don't expect to plan your own children's funeral. So it was really strange.
2 weeks on from the murders, mourners line the streets of Manchester to pay their respects to Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes.
I mean, it was a horrendous occasion for me, but support we had leading up to it and then on the day, it made you soaked it up, you soaked the energy up from people. Even though it was a sad occasion, obviously.
It felt like the country stopped. Certainly Manchester came to a stop. And I can't tell you what it meant for our officers, just the, number one, the enormous support from our colleagues.
We were taken to Manchester Cathedral a few days earlier just to see what the cathedral looked like and meet the principal people conducting the service. And we thought, how are you going to fill this place? It's vast. And that came as quite a shock. The sheer number of people when you got outside the cathedral and all those people standing, bowing their heads, was amazingly humbling.
I remember on the day of the funerals, it was just desperately sad. I'd never seen Manchester come to such a standstill, and I think it was at that moment that it became clear that this had affected two families, in that their lives would never be the same again, but also the wider police family.
As Fiona and Nicola were laid to rest, their colleagues struggled to cope with the tragedy.
I felt so responsible for their deaths, and still do. You try to reassure the public that you can keep them safe and look after them, and yet I was unable to do that for my own.
The divisional commander tried to resign, but was eventually persuaded to stay in his position. In 4 months, 4 innocent people had been murdered on the streets of Manchester. Those believed to be responsible, Dale Cregan and a number of his associates, had yet to be punished for their crimes.
Cregan gave himself up. He didn't want to be killed. And then there was an enormous investigation. And people may think, well, that's easy. You know, it's obviously him that did it. But you then obviously have to prove the whole sequence. We had to try and find out where he had been, who had sheltered him, who had supported him, all the other criminal associates that had been involved in the case. So there was an enormous investigation.
The level of security surrounding Dale Cregan's trial was unprecedented. He pleaded not guilty to any of the murders.
There were armed officers routinely deployed. There were armed officers on the roofs of nearby buildings and around the court. And it was clear that police were under no illusions just as to how dangerous this man was. 2 weeks into the trial, Dale Cregan decided to change his plea to guilty for the murder of the 2 police officers. Dale Cregan said that he murdered the 2 police officers because his family had been hounded over the months that he was being sought for the murders of Mark and David Short, and that this was his way of exacting revenge.
As the trial continued, he also changed his plea to guilty for the murders of Mark and David Short. And after 19 intense weeks, the jury found him guilty of all 4 murders.
Well, at the end of the trial, Dale Cregan was handed a whole life tariff. Now, that's not something we see frequently.
Cregan was given the most severe prison sentence available in the UK. And the other suspects, Luke Livesey and Damien Gorman, received life in prison for murdering Mark Short and the attempted murder of 3 of his friends. Jermaine Ward and Anthony Wilkinson were found guilty and given life sentences for their part in the murder of David Short.
If you take someone's life, then you deserve, you know, for the rest of your life, you're incarcerated, you're locked up. And that's what I think if I focused on that person, it eats away. It's like taking poison up in yourself and up in there dying, they don't.
Cregan has shown no remorse for his crimes since the murders. But despite the trauma suffered by the families, lasting legacies were formed in Fiona and Nicola's names.
You've got 2 choices in there. You can either give up, you can either go and hide yourself away, or you can carry on. You can pull yourself up. And I know what Nicola said. She said, pull yourself together, carry on, get up and do something. I needed something as a challenge for myself, and there was 3 charities that helped us in the early stages, and I wanted to give them something back. So I thought I'd run a marathon for that.
In March 2014, Bryn established the Nicola Hughes Memorial Fund to give support and skills to young people who have suffered a tragic loss.
So we thought, well, yeah, we'll do things to help them practical-wise. We'll pay for driving lessons for them, we'll pay for school shoes, because, let's face it, if Dad's murdered, family incomes, it could be gone, could be wiped out.
And a lasting tribute was also paid to Fiona. A building was named in her honour.
When we found out, we said, yes, that's a wonderful thing, and they invited us across to lay the foundation stone. Fiona would have enjoyed Fiona Gardens. She did Duke of Edinburgh's Gold Award as a care assistant in a care home on the Isle of Man. I think you've just got to remember the good times. You can't dwell on the bad. You can't do anything about the person who's died. In the evening, we'd possibly ring each other, and I really miss those phones. It was incredibly hard not to do it. And I was finding myself in tears going along bits of road for no apparent reasons, you know. I really do miss Fiona. And nobody to play with anymore, and nobody to take me out drinking when they shouldn't, things like that.
I still remember us laughing her head off and you know, being friendly and practical jokes and jumping on me when she sees me and everything else. So that's how I remember Nicola.
She just wanted to kill people. It really is as simple as that. I was terrified, absolutely terrified.
We were frantically making contact to say, you have a murderer and a murderer's accomplice in this vehicle, in your policing area right now, and you need to arrest them.
In my 32 years' experience of policing the streets of West Mercia, I have never experienced anything like this.
The girl that killed those people is not my daughter. My daughter's that nice 14-year-old that never came home.
I remember distinctly feeling, oh my God, when is this going to stop?
Hereford's a typical rural market town. Very low levels of crime and disorder, very safe place, great for tourism, which made this particular incident so unusual and really stood out.
On the 2nd of April 2013, the city of Hereford witnessed two crimes so brutal and so horrific that they would thrust an otherwise sleepy community into the news headlines.
There are reports of a series of brutal attacks in the Hunderton area of Hereford, which began this afternoon. Several people are believed to have been attacked.
In separate random assaults, two men are savagely set upon whilst innocently walking their dogs.
Your instinct is one of disbelief, really. A stabbing on the street is bad. Two stabbings, frenzied attacks, and as brutal as they were really, really significant. And of course, it is incredibly unusual for a woman to conduct attacks like that.
The woman in question was Joanne Dennehy. But what police didn't know at the time was that the stabbings she'd committed on the streets of Hereford were the final crimes in a 14-day killing spree that started over 140 miles away in Cambridgeshire. Peterborough, 75 miles north of the capital. It has a population of 190,000 people. And in 2013, it was the home of letting agent Kevin Lee.
Kevin had a business called Quick Let, and that business was letting rooms out to homeless and vulnerable people.
Many of Quick Let's properties were in the Orton Goldhay area of Peterborough. 3 miles from the centre of town, it's a densely populated estate with lots of former council properties now owned by private landlords.
There wasn't a lot of vetting done, to be quite honest. Some used to be let out of prison, some people used to get kicked out of home. They'd go to the council and the council would recommend go to Quick Let. So it was that type of person that he used to let rooms to.
And this is how Kevin Lee would first meet Joanne Dennehy. 30-year-old Dennehy had just been released from prison, where she'd served a 14-week sentence for theft. But that wasn't the story she told unsuspecting businessman Kevin Lee.
She said that she'd come out of prison. She'd been in prison for 8 years because she'd murdered her father, because her father had raped her, which was a complete fabrication, and that she'd also burnt 2 people in a house fire and ran 2 people over in a car. So she'd killed a lot of people.
Joanne Dennehy would later be recognised as a pathological liar with psychopathic tendencies. But at the time, Kevin Lee had no reason to doubt what he was being told.
I just think because of his upbringing, like he was adopted, he just wanted to give people a chance in life. He said, oh, I just really want to help her.
He may have seen an opportunity to help a person in need, but Lee also realised that along with her friend, 7'3" Gary Stretch, Dennehy could be the perfect person to help him when it came to handling troublesome tenants. Police would later discover that Kevin Lee was deeply attracted to Dennehy. In order to win her affections, he would allow her to live in one of his houses, rent-free, and would often buy her gifts. On one occasion, he even gave her the money to buy a car.
She was given a free room to stay in and kept her housing benefit, and then just went along to the houses like a thug, just threatening people to move out. And I think Kev needed that kind of help because he was that desperate to get rid of people.
On the 29th of March 2013, Lee had arranged to meet with Dennehy at one of his Peterborough properties. And when he failed to come home that night, his wife Christina instinctively knew something was wrong.
I thought, something's not right. You know, it's not like Kevin not to return. And I called him, but his phone was off. So I was already a little bit suspicious, really. That night was just absolutely awful.
Unable to find Kevin, Christina reported her husband's disappearance to the police.
I was the senior investigating officer on call for major crime over the Easter weekend in 2013. I went to, as most forces do, a morning meeting to look at the threat, harm and risk ongoing incidents across the force. And an officer in Peterborough raised the issue of a missing from home called Kevin Lee. All of my instincts were saying, this is a bad news story and it's going to unfold as a bad news story.
Those concerns were confirmed later that day, when police discovered the remains of Kevin's burnt-out car on a farm track in nearby Yaxley.
When the police had told me they'd found a burnt-out car, I knew something sinister had happened. And then the next day, the detectives turned up to say that they'd found a body. And I knew it was Kevin.
Kevin Lee's body had been discovered in a ditch by the A16 in Newborough by a man walking his dog. He was wearing ladies' clothing and appeared to have been deliberately left in a humiliating position.
It didn't look natural to me. It looked very manipulated. What I saw was a man's body laying on the edge of a drainage ditch in a farmer's field, wearing a black sequin dress that had been pulled up above the waist.
The dress that Kevin was wearing had numerous holes in it that were quickly identified as having been made by a knife. He'd been stabbed 5 times in the chest, with the wounds penetrating both lungs and his heart.
From that point, it was clear to me that we were now dealing with a murder investigation and something way more than misadventure or an accident.
The ditch Kevin Lee's body was found in was in a remote area of the Fens, a factor that would make the investigation that would follow much harder for the attending detectives.
I was standing in the middle of a field with no witnesses, no CCTV, no likely prospect of automatic number plate recognition or a mechanism to identify which vehicles had been in the vicinity. All of the traditional investigative methods were going to be stripped away from the early investigation very, very quickly. So I concluded fairly early on that the answer to this would probably lay in the association that people would have with Kevin in part and parcel of his daily life, or indeed a hidden segment of his life that perhaps his family were unaware of.
With very little evidence to go on, police examined Kevin Lee's phone records.
One of the real ironies of this investigation was that Christina Lee would become absolutely pivotal to identify who killed her husband. It was her frantic activity ringing telephone numbers that were in Kevin's phone from billing that would eventually allow the police to determine that at the time of Kevin's Mondeo being burned in Yaxley, Joanne Dennehy's mobile phone was in the same proximity or cell site. So the link between the burning car, Kevin being missing, and Joanne Dennehy being in proximity to the car when it was on fire put her as a suspect very early on into the investigation.
Police quickly went to 38 Byfield in Orton Goldhay, the property owned by Kevin Lee, where Joanne Dennehy had been living. Dennehy was nowhere to be seen, but what officers found was a chilling crime scene. A blood-stained mattress had been dumped in the back garden of the property. But forensic testing would show that the blood didn't match that of Kevin Lee. And to add to the detectives' concerns, Royal Navy veteran John Chapman, another of Quicklet's tenants, had also mysteriously vanished. Born and raised in the picturesque Hertfordshire town of Harpenden, Dennehy's childhood years were much like that of any ordinary young girl.
Like everybody else, she liked to go to the playground. She was just a happy girl. Very sensitive girl, though. She was very sensitive. Like, you know, if she stood on a worm or something, she would be really upset. So she was a loving girl. When she was at school, she always had a good report. I never had to go to the school because she had a problem. She was polite to everybody. The teachers always said that she was a nice girl.
But when Joanne Dennehy hit her teens, her parents would see a dramatic change in her personality. She started to play truant from school and often found herself in trouble with the police. Her family's concerns were further compounded when at the age of 14, she started a long-term relationship with a man 6 years older than her.
We were at the stage where we were begging her to please just finish school. You know, the boy we didn't like, there wasn't any doubt about it. We compromised and we said, look, bring him round for dinner. At weekends, same weekends. We just wanted her to finish and have some kind of education and a decent kind of life. But she didn't want to know. She really didn't want to, and neither did he. It just escalated from there.
Everybody says that a child has a bad period of time, you know, be unruly and whatever. So we just thought, well, that's it. She's going to leave home at 15, come back at 18, 20, and we thought, as long as she comes home with healthy and okay, and no, you know, then life will just go back to what it was.
No, I always thought she'd come back. I did honestly think she would come back. Do you know, when people say that because we've obviously not been in our life now for maybe 10, 15 years, but people would say to you, oh, how many children have you got? And I'd say 2. We have Maria and we have Joanna. And Maria's obviously been in the army, done all this. And they say, well, what about Joanna? And I say, she's a free spirit. She's out there wandering around somewhere. Because that's what I thought, you know, she was doing her own thing, and when she finally grew up, she would come home. But she never did come back to us.
Estranged from her parents, Joanne Dennehy's life spiralled into one of crime. She served various short prison sentences for dishonesty, as well as carrying a blade in a public place. In 2012, she also received a community service order for assault, and in that same year found herself serving a 14-week sentence for theft. It was after being released from Peterborough Prison that she would first meet landlord Kevin Lee. Lee owned a number of properties in the area, and Dennehy and her friend Gary Stretch became his enforcers, helping him to put pressure on troublesome tenants to either pay up or move out. But the relationship between Kevin Lee and Joanne Dennehy became more than just a business one.
She was a very manipulative person that manipulated a lot of people. I think she did the same to Kevin, lured him in, and unfortunately that cost him his life.
On the afternoon of the 29th of March, Kevin went to Rolleston Garth with presents to give Joanne There is no doubt that the meeting was geared around a sexual interaction between the two, and certainly the dress was a prop used in that sexual encounter. Kevin was stabbed several times in the chest, and it's clear to me that that took place as part and parcel of sexual activity, or certainly intimacy, in one of the rooms at Rolleston Garth.
By now, detectives were well aware of the connection between Kevin Lee and Joanne Dennehy. She was their prime suspect in his murder. So finding her and her accomplice Gary Stretch became their #1 priority.
Very quickly, a manhunt started over the weekend where, quite unusually, we went to seek the media's help, given a 7'3" giant of a man in the company of a striking woman who's got a tattoo of a star on her cheek. We were on the run. I really needed the public's help in telling me where they were because the risk to them was great. The significant line of inquiry that came out of the public appeal actually came from a police officer in Norfolk. He'd seen the appeal, and he was also investigating a drive-off from a petrol forecourt where a girl had gone into the kiosk, stolen some biscuits and food from within, and then driven off quickly. He gave me the registration number of the car, and that was the absolute missing link in the investigation. The irony of that vehicle was that it was actually paid for by Kevin, and it was a gift to Joanne, who subsequently would use that vehicle to deposit Kevin's body in the ditch at Newborough. But as soon as we had that registration number, we put it into the national computer for automatic number plate recognition, and we could see the car moving and activating on cameras as it was travelling down the M5 motorway towards the southwest.
During their journey, Dennehy and her accomplice Stretch were frequently caught on CCTV cameras. This footage from a motorway service station on the M5 was filmed just 72 hours after the discovery of Kevin Lee's body in the ditch at Newborough. But these wouldn't be the only images of Dennehy and Stretch that the police would discover during their investigation.
Whilst Joanne and Gary were on the run, they were committing crimes. I call it subsistence crime. They were literally stealing food to exist. And at one of the burglaries, they stole a camera. And they used that camera throughout their journey on the run from the police. And they were taking really bizarre photographs of them as if they were tourists. It was almost like they were on a trip to have as much fun as they could before the inevitable arrest happened.
On the run and low on cash, the pair now needed to sell some of the things they'd stolen. So they travelled to the Herefordshire town of Kington, where a friend of Gary Stretch's would put them in touch with former petty thief Mark Lloyd.
Up until that day, I'd never met Joanne Dennehy, never heard of her, never spoken to her. Me and Gary had a passing relationship because we shared the same jail system. And that's all the connection between me and Gary.
But Mark Lloyd's criminal connections were about to put him in a position that he never could have imagined.
Gone into the front room, the table's full of tablets, TVs and all that. That's when she's pulled a knife out and said, I've just killed 3 people, I want to kill some more.
Mark Lloyd found himself in a house with Gary and Joanne, and straight away found himself in a position where he too felt that he probably had to comply with whatever request was made of him.
I honestly did fear for my own life then. I thought, if I don't play these games, she's going to attack me. It was obvious straight away that Joanne had complete control over Gary Stretch. It was strange watching her control a man who could literally pick her up and snap her in half. He wasn't besotted, he was bewitched, under a spell. I don't care what people say, he was under a spell. She was in total control of the situation.
Joanne's controlling traits go back probably to her mid-teens, to the point that she leaves the family environment. We've spoken to a number of people who seem to be under the spell of Joanne for periods in their life, certainly men in sexual relationships with her. She was very, very capable of getting what she wanted from a situation, very crafted in manipulating people and men specifically.
Now Mark Lloyd was about to become the next man to fall under Dennehy's control. She needed to get to nearby Hereford to sell some of the items she'd stolen. and he was told in no uncertain terms that he would be going with her.
Drive from Kington to Hereford, it was, yeah, that was horrific. She was drinking whiskey, she was getting more aggressive, more excitable, basically. Kept showing me the knife, telling Gary to drive slowly, and then all of a sudden she'd pull over and say, right, I want a photograph. And she got me posing for photographs, made me drink half a bottle of whiskey, which I'm amazed I kept down. And we slowly made our way to Hereford.
The drive from Kington to Hereford took around 45 minutes, and when they arrived, Dennehy took Mark Lloyd into this shop to buy cigarettes.
She's right behind me. I mean, people think she's giving me a hug. She's not giving me a hug. She's got not the blade on me, but she's got the handle on me. And she's saying to me, look, Mark, just get the cigarettes. And when the till was open, I honestly thought she was going to leap the counter and rob the money out the till. And thankfully, strange thing to say, I know, but thankfully she started flirting with her.
But Dennehy's playful mood was about to take a much darker turn. Now back in the car, holding the knife she'd used to kill Kevin Lee, she set about finding a random member of the public to attack.
Her and Gary having a discussion. She's going, I want my fun now, find me a victim, find me a victim. No women, no children, and I'm sat in the back thinking, the first person this person sees, she's going to do something. And within 30 seconds of leaving the shop, Gary's physically pointed through the window and said, will he do?
Mark Lloyd was about to witness something unthinkable on the streets of Hereford, something that would leave an innocent man fighting for his life. The man that Gary Stretch had spotted was retired Hereford firefighter Robin Barretza.
Mr. Brezza was walking along a street in Hereford called Westphaling Street, actually walking towards his home address, taking his dog for a walk. An innocent man going about his daily business. And the actual attack took place on him not very far from his home address. He was attacked from behind. He said it felt like he was being punched in the back. He turned around and he was struck on the arm. He actually fought back. But of course the stabbing was so serious that he was very, very badly injured.
What made this assault even more shocking was that it happened in such a public place.
The location where Mr. Brezza was attacked, it's a very pleasant area. It's very peaceful. It's next to the main cemetery in town. This was shortly after 3 o'clock. There would have been lots of children about as well.
There's one particular piece of CCTV footage on the side of a health centre which shows Robin Barretza walking past, and then in close proximity the green Vauxhall Astra which Joanne and Gary were in. And of course the consequences of just a few moments later led to the terrible injuries to Robin Barretza.
In broad daylight, 63-year-old Robin Barretza was stabbed twice and left with potentially fatal injuries to his upper body.
I thought the man was dead, and she's calmly got back in the car, gave Gary a kiss on the cheek, and then wanted to do some more.
And they then spent the next 4 or 5 minutes driving around looking for their next intended target. And it was Gary's proposal to Joanne, what about him, when they saw John Rogers.
John Rogers, a 56-year-old man, lived in Hereford, liked playing the guitar, was just a man who kept himself to himself largely. He was walking his dog and he was attacked from behind by Dennehy.
Joanne's just got out the car very, very casually, walked up to the bloke, did something exactly the same as before because he wasn't startled or anything. He stopped, she probably mentioned the dog again, and then she's got in really, really close, and then it was a blur. It was like a slash or a movie. And I honestly thought the first man was definitely dead, but I thought this man has just died in front of me.
At one point, he was face down on the ground and had received terrible stab wounds to his back and upper body. She turned him over and did the same to the front. And John has subsequently told us that he felt his life ebbing away from him as he watched blood from his own body trickle away down the street.
As Joe's walked back with the dog, which totally spanned my head, she's got back in the front seat. No mention of the bloke, no mention of the fact that she's just killed someone in front of me. Said to Gary, that was nice, I need to do some more. As I'm looking past through the windscreen, the poor victim is like crawling, literally on his hands and knees, and then he goes round the corner.
56-year-old John Rogers was stabbed more than 30 times in the back, chest and abdomen during a sustained attack that punctured both of his lungs and left him fighting for his life. Despite his significant injuries, he managed to crawl almost 100 yards to this path, where he would be helped by a passing member of the public.
I've 32 years' experience of policing the streets of West Mercia, and I, in my former time as a detective, have been involved in a number of inquiries. These two attacks were the most brutal stabbing offences that I've ever been cited on or involved with in my service. And I have no doubt at all that it was due to the skill of paramedics and medical people that meant that those two gentlemen, their lives were saved.
The injured men were airlifted to hospital in a critical condition. But Dennehy hadn't finished her frenzied rampage. She was still at large and looking for more victims on the streets of Hereford.
By this time, I can hear sirens everywhere. I mean, I'm not exaggerating, they were everywhere. And I'm thinking, this ain't gonna be too long, this ain't gonna be too long, this ain't gonna be... And then I was thinking, if I'm hearing this and Joe and Gary are hearing this, she's gonna think, wow, sod you, Ma.
Just a few hundred metres from where John Rogers was attacked is a small row of shops. And it was here that armed police would end Joanne Dennehy's reign of terror.
The officers approached Joanne Dennehy in the car. She was still holding the weapon that she'd used to attack both men. She was later described by the officers as actually being very calm and very cooperative. She was arrested and brought back to the police station.
If she and Gary had not been arrested when they were, I'm absolutely clear that the carnage would have continued. There is no doubt in my mind that the casualty list would have grown until she was stopped.
With Dennehy now in police custody, her parents were informed of her whereabouts for the first time in almost 10 years.
Well, I got a phone call from my wife, Kate, and said, I've got to speak to you face to face, and it's serious. Met the wife, and the wife said that our daughter had done a serious crime and they're not looking for anybody other than our daughter. And we just looked at each other and were devastated, didn't know what to do.
You can't imagine that. There's no words to say it. I can't tell you how difficult it was because I feel like I just turned off. Do you know, it feels like bereavement. You bring up your baby from baby to 14, never a problem. Then all of a sudden, the rebellion starts, which we expected. Then she gets into more and more trouble, and then she decides that I'm not staying here, I'm going off with my new friend. And then someone's knocking at the door saying that she's a murderer.
Joanne Dennehy was detained at Hereford Police Station in connection with the murder of Kevin Lee in Cambridgeshire and the attempted murders of Robin Barretta and John Rogers. But even the most experienced officers were surprised by her behaviour.
Her attacks were incredibly vicious, and not very many minutes later, she's been arrested and she's in a police station being booked into the cell block and actually joking with staff. It's very, very concerning behaviour.
You are Joanne Christina Dennehy.
What you can't see from this footage is that I'm literally on the next desk being booked in. It just amazes me how unemotional the woman was. She didn't act like a person who'd just been arrested for 2 attempted murders and a murder. She looked like she just, I don't know, day out for jumping around, happy, flirting with the officers.
You're very distinctive eyebrows.
I know, so you keep saying. So
It's clear to me that she's enjoying the spectacle, that people are looking at her as somebody that's about to become notorious.
Three words. A big fat black rabbit. Big fat black rabbit.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure that would be worse though.
Yeah, worse. Yeah.
The way that she portrayed herself as smiley and interacting on a humorous level with the officers says to me, morally, she has no regard for what she's just done. She has no regard for the devastation left behind, and she loved being the centre of attention.
Why isn't it pen and paper? Because this makes my signature look really dodgy.
I think Joanne is a person who enjoys the catastrophe that she leaves behind. I think she has become more and more involved in killing because she's done it for the first time. She apparently got away with it for the first time, and she enjoyed the experience. And somebody who's prepared to accelerate their behaviour because they enjoy something as gory as killing is a very dangerous individual indeed.
When I saw the CCTV footage of Jo, it was like somebody I didn't know. She's standing there being charged, smiling and laughing with police officers. That's not the kind, loving Joanna that was our baby.
The day after Joanne had been arrested, I was in the major incident room with my investigating team, and the phone rang, and it was the control room. And the control room operator said to me, a body has been found in Thorney Dyke, just northeast of Peterborough. And I fully expected that to be the body of John Chapman. He'd been missing from the house that Joanne lived at, and couldn't account for his whereabouts at all, and there were some real concerns around his welfare. Almost immediately the phone rang again, and when I spoke to the operator in the control room, the conversation went along the lines of, are you aware of the body in the ditch at Thorney Dyke? And I said, yes, I'd just taken a call. And the operator said, there's 2 bodies in the ditch. I remember distinctly feeling, oh my God, when is this going to stop? And there was a genuine palpable sense of shock that went through the incident room. If that was John Chapman, who's the second person? And in which case, how many more?
The first body the police identified in the ditch at Thorney Dyke was that of John Chapman, the man police have been looking for since he disappeared from the Orton Goldhay house he'd shared with Joanne Dennehy 5 days earlier.
John Chapman was a really simple man with a simple lifestyle. Everybody talked about him with fondness. He was a drinker, he was a street drinker, he did nobody any harm. It's clear from the investigation that John Chapman was well acquainted with Joanne, and I suspect there may well have been a confrontation in that property that led to him being murdered in that house, in the very same house that Kevin Lee owned. He was killed in his bedroom, probably whilst he was incapacitated through his addiction to alcohol. He had a number of closely confined stab wounds in his chest, and subsequently the mattress that he was killed on was removed from his bedroom and dumped in the garden, no secret of the fact that it was heavily blood-stained.
The second body retrieved from the ditch at Thorney Dyke belonged to 31-year-old Lukas Slabozewski.
Lukas Slabozewski was a Polish national living in Peterborough, had family around the UK, lived a relatively chaotic lifestyle, more than sufficient evidence to say that he was a regular drug user, would be in the city, where perhaps people homeless living in shelters or reliant on soup kitchens would congregate. And I think that's probably where the association with Dennehy was established.
This CCTV footage, filmed on the 19th of March 2013, shows Lucas's final movements on the day he went missing. Shortly after withdrawing money from this cash point, he would visit Joanne Dennehy at one of Kevin Lee's properties on Rolleston Garth in Peterborough.
Clearly there was an arranged meeting between he and Joanne, and I'm in no doubt that that was driven by sex, an agreement to meet for sex. What we know is that Lukas was attacked in that property and he was stabbed in the chest, at least one of those stab wounds piercing his heart, and he died in the house at Rolleston Garth, having pre-arranged meeting with Joanne there.
Police believed that Lukas was in fact Dennehy's first victim, having been killed 10 days before John Chapman and Kevin Lee. Forensic officers were able to determine that his attack probably started in the bathroom of the property. A significant number of blood spots were found in the living room, suggesting the assault had been long and sustained. And this was reinforced by the injuries found on Lucas's body after it was retrieved from the ditch in Thorney Dyke.
The depth of the wounds were much more than superficial, and the extent to which the knife went into Lucas's heart showed a high degree of violence.
Police were now aware that Joanne Dennehy had killed 3 people in Peterborough and savagely attacked 2 more before leaving them for dead on the streets of Hereford. And as their inquiries continued, they would gain further insight into the mind of a killer who appeared to show no remorse for her actions.
A really disturbing element of this investigation was Joanne made no secret of the fact that she'd killed Lucas. She told a number of people. And on one occasion, before her arrest, she took a young girl to a wheelie bin in the proximity of Rolleston Garth, where she had placed Lucas's body, and he'd been there for a number of days. And she showed a then 14-year-old girl the body of Lucas.
The evidence against Joanne Dennehy was compelling. And on the 18th of November 2013, she attended a pre-trial hearing at the Old Bailey in London, where she stood accused of murdering Lucas Labazewski, John Chapman and Kevin Lee. She was also charged with 2 counts of attempted murder.
We anticipated a long drawn-out trial, and a lot of work had been put in to prepare for just that. But it was a shock to everybody in that packed courtroom. After 10 minutes, she stood up in response to being read the indictments, and she pleaded guilty. Nobody expected that to happen.
When I heard Joanne had pleaded guilty, I was very surprised, because I thought that she'd wanted notoriety. She wanted to be in the limelight. She wanted to be recognised as doing something. But I was very surprised.
I think that she may even have made that decision at the moment that she stood up. I think it might have been as late in the day as that, because she could see a packed courtroom, the most famous court in the country. All eyes were on her, and this was her last opportunity to control the situation in a way that she wanted to.
On February the 28th, 2014, 3 months after her guilty plea, Joanne Dennehy returned to the Old Bailey, where she was sentenced to a whole life tariff.
The fact that she'll never see daylight again in the outside world is of huge comfort for the family. And whilst I don't measure success of any investigation on prison time, in this case, for Joanne Dennehy, it's absolutely the right thing that she won't come out of prison.
On sentencing, the judge told Dennehy she was a cruel, calculating, selfish and manipulative serial killer. She simply laughed when she was told she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. These are the walls that now protect the public from a cold-hearted, calculated female serial killer. And few would argue that the whole life tariff she was handed is anything but appropriate.
In my opinion, Joanne Dennehy is the most dangerous individual in the criminal justice system today. She has no emotion, she will not consider the consequences of her actions, and behaves in a way that is not erratic, it's calculated.
If I'm brutally honest, I don't ever want her to come out. I think because she would do it again. Because she has no remorse. So she deserved what she got. The world's safer without Joanna in it.
This case was the most demanding investigation emotionally on my team, on me, and the families involved, and principally those loved ones left behind. I've never experienced the catastrophe in the numbers that the events were unfolding in any other investigation, and I suspect it will remain that way for the rest of my career.
For his involvement in Dennehy's 14-day reign of terror, Gary Stretch was charged with 3 counts of preventing the lawful burying of a body and 2 further counts of the attempted murder of Robin Barretza and John Rogers. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, of which he must serve a minimum of 19 years.
The reason that Gary Stretch is serving a life sentence is because he enabled Joanne Dennehy to attack John Rogers after he had seen the terrible events of Robin Barrezza unfold in front of him.
2 other men, Leslie Layton and Robert Moore, were also charged with assisting Dennehy in moving the bodies of her victims in Peterborough and for perverting the course of justice. They received sentences of 14 and 3 years, respectively. Ex-con Mark Lloyd, who was in the car on the day of the Hereford attacks, was found to have no case to answer. But meeting with Joanne Dennehy has changed his life forever.
She's destroyed my life, seriously. I was on the verge of getting a normal life. I was on the verge of getting a job. I'd left the bail hostel. I was no longer on probation. I had no outstanding warrants. I was clean for the first time since 1979. She's destroyed my life. If that's the price I have to pay, that's the price I have to pay. I could be dead.
Dennehy's cold-blooded crimes have shattered the lives of her own family too.
But we have not talked to her, spoke to her. I don't think she wanted to speak to us anyway, and I wouldn't like to see her.
To me, she doesn't exist anymore because she's destroyed people. So I would never want anything to do with her, because she's not my Jo. The girl that killed those people is not my daughter. My daughter's that nice 14-year-old that never came home.
Joanne Dennehy will continue to be a threat while she's in jail. She is the personality that will continue to manipulate. She will manipulate whatever environment she's in, and she will continue to be a threat to staff and other prisoners in jail for as long as she's alive.
But the biggest loss of all will be suffered by the families of those that Joanne Dennehy callously killed during her 14-day reign of terror in the spring of 2013.
I just wish she'd never walked in, and I just wish that Kevin had never given her the chance that he'd given everyone else, because there's always one bad apple. Unfortunately, Kevin made one mistake and it cost him his life.
This is the gunman from Berkeley last night. What I'm phoning about is to tell you exactly why I've done what I've done.
Police are saying there is a heightened risk to people's safety tonight.
We have decided to offer a £10,000 reward.
A normal week in the summer was ruined by armed police arriving in the town.
The vehicle checkpoints continue all around the village.
Amidst the green moorland, the black sight and barrel of a marksman's rifle.
I didn't think he would do something like that. I just didn't think he would actually kill someone.
We had clear, declared intent to harm members of the public or members of Northumbria Police. You couldn't get any clearer than that. And for me, you can't get any more dangerous than that.
On Friday the 9th of July 2010, at around 7 p.m, a man holding a gun emerged from the woods surrounding the town of Rothbury, Northumberland.
He's holding the firearm to himself and is non-compliant at present.
His sighting marked the final stages of one of the biggest police operations the country had ever seen.
Move back, in a line.
Raoul Moat, Britain's most wanted man, had been found.
Moat was contained, challenged to put his weapon down, but simply dropped to the ground and put the gun to his head.
Negotiations between Moat and the police would continue for the next 6 hours. The eyes of the world were centred on Rothbury, with the standoff being broadcast live on TV and radio. The events that led to the armed standoff in this quiet corner of the country actually began years earlier, when Raoul Moat met Samantha Stobbart in a Newcastle nightclub.
Sam used to love to go out, discos. She was going to the nightclubs since she was about 15. Her mum used to take her to the nightclubs when she was 15 on a school night.
She met him on a night out down Newcastle Big Market when he was working as a bouncer on the doors.
Because Samantha was slim and young and blonde, Raoul made a beeline for her. That was it. She fell hook, line and sinker. It was her world. Their relationship, it blew hot and cold. One minute they were all lovey-dovey, the next it was arguments. And he was very abusive to her.
You're not going out and got something fucking jealous about that, no. Absolutely. You know what?
And then he would come over and he would give her the soft soap again and she would go back and it would all start all over again.
When I first met Raoul, I liked him. I thought he was nice. He would do anything to help you. But once you got on the wrong side of Raoul, if you said something you didn't agree with, that was it. He would fall out with you and you would face the consequences.
Raoul had to have a girl on his arm. He had to. And she had to be good looking and she had to be slim and fit and well toned. He liked everybody to envy him.
I think he was a control freak. He wouldn't let her out the house with makeup on and things like that.
He always had to be with her, even if she was going to the shops. He had to be with her.
Raoul Moat's an interesting character. Not that unusual among men who are controlling or domineering in their relationships. Some of these characteristics for Raoul Moat have included suspiciousness, jealousy, and control. These are often found in relationships where people in themselves are actually quite insecure, but they're hoping to compensate for that through controlling others.
He had a difficult childhood, a difficult relationship with his mother. A lot of people have said he was so determined to have a normal family life with Samantha. I think when that broke down, that's when everything unravelled for Raoul.
Raoul Moat was 37. A native of the northeast of England, he was father to several children, including one with his current partner, Sam. Although he was known to police, his criminal record contained few clues to the havoc he would go on to cause.
He wasn't a career criminal or a criminal of any significance from the policing point of view. He was certainly somebody who had come to our attention, was known to us. He had about 12 arrests over a 10-year period for lower-level assault-type incidents, but he was known to us and other agencies for his family background. He had a history of domestic abuse in his relationships, but from his background as a door supervisor and a door steward in Newcastle, he certainly came to the attention of the police in terms of the occasional arrest for assault.
Moat was a keen bodybuilder and also used steroids.
One of the things about steroids is the research shows that not everybody becomes more aggressive through prolonged use of steroids. What seems to be happening is that aspects of an individual's character are exaggerated as a result of steroid abuse. So some people may become more aggressive, others might not.
Once when she'd come over to mine, he'd picked her up and thrown her against the wall. Then he calms down and he's full of apologies and and I used to think it must be this, whatever he's taking, steroids or whatever, it's got to have some effect on them.
I would call it his ride rage. That's what I used to say. You on your ride rage again? Have his steroids.
By 2010, Samantha had decided she'd had enough of her violent boyfriend, and in the spring of that year, she was presented with the perfect opportunity to break free.
Raoul Moat was sent to prison in April of 2010 after being convicted of an assault on his young daughter. I think it's important to point out that they had actually been separated for quite a while. And while Raoul Moat was in prison, I think Samantha probably saw that as an opportunity to put some distance between themselves. And it was while he was in prison that she tried to finalise and finish the relationship and totally sever links with him. But he was a very controlling character and he wasn't prepared to let Sam do that, and it was certainly something he didn't want.
One of the difficulties for people who get involved in controlling relationships is that they need a willing partner, somebody who's prepared to go along with that. When the relationship is threatened, it's a threat to that individual who's controlling. They don't want to lose that. That's what they've worked hard to try and manage. And that's when people can react quite viciously.
Raoul Moat's revenge was certainly vicious. Not only did his girlfriend want rid of him, he was stunned when Samantha revealed she had actually met someone else while he was in prison. His name was Christopher Brown, and it was a relationship that would have a tragic ending.
Christopher Brown was a lad from the south of England who moved to Newcastle to try and start a career as a karate instructor, whose only mistake was to meet Samantha Stobart and start a relationship with Samantha Stobart. While Raoul Moat was in prison, Samantha had a number of conversations. She used the expression or used the excuse that he was a police officer. I don't think that she did that to purposely provoke Moat. I think she was doing that to try and frighten him off. But unfortunately, it had exactly the opposite effect, and it did in fact provoke him.
Chris Brown wasn't and never had been a police officer. This apparently innocent lie told by Sam about her new boyfriend would have fatal consequences. Raoul Moat hated the police, and the thought of his ex dating a copper made him furious.
Raoul's attitude to the police, he just hated them. He wanted nothing to do with the police, he just didn't like them at all.
He believed the police, the social services, the prison authorities, his ex-girlfriends were all picking on him, but it was nothing to do with him.
One of the traits that we find really quite often when it comes to violence within relationships is that there's an externalization of blame. It's always somebody else's fault. When people externalize blame, it's not always simply directed at an individual. It's more of a characteristic within them, an enduring trait. So often that blame will be put on anybody who's a ready-made target. The police can be targeted. They're seen as being overzealous or picking on people.
Fueled by his hatred of the authorities, Moat began to put his plan for revenge against Samantha Stobart into place. While still in prison, he quickly contacted the outside world. One of the first people he called was an old friend, Carl Ness.
Moat had tasked Carl Ness to get a certain individual to visit him in prison while he was in prison because he wanted to speak to him about getting a car with 6 wheels. A car with 6 wheels, as far as I'm concerned and my inquiry team were concerned, was a gun with 6 cartridges. That individual was a suspected armourer. So I think it was a reasonable assumption that we were working on that was him trying to secure a weapon for when he got released from prison.
Moat was released from Durham prison on Thursday, the 1st of July, and he wasted no time putting his plan into action.
On coming out of prison, he'd effectively lost everything that he had been sustained by emotionally. With little to lose, there was the possibility at that point that he would seek revenge in an extreme way.
We have CCTV footage of Carl Ness turning up at Moat's home address, carrying what we believed to be the gun in a blue bag, which was later recovered from the scene. We got evidence from computers and telephones that they were trying to contact sports centres in the Birtley area where it was believed that Christopher Brown was operating his business as a karate instructor. They were doing dummy runs, again, I believe, trying to find out who Christopher Brown was, identify a car, identify him.
As well as tracking down their target, Moat and Ness started planning for the aftermath and the possibility that they would be on the run.
Raoul Moat was caught on CCTV in the B&Q store in Scotswood in Newcastle, picking up camping supplies and the sort of thing you would need to live out in the countryside.
Hours later, their hunt for Chris Brown proved successful. They had tracked both him and Samantha down to a friend's house in Birtley, near Gateshead.
That's when Moat and Ness put the plan into practice, where he lay in wait outside the house until the early hours of the morning.
Moat was sitting outside the window of the house where Sam and her new boyfriend were that night. They were having a few drinks together, you know, just having a normal night, talking and laughing. Text messages between Moat's phone and Carl Ness's phone showed that he was listening to what they were saying, and he was getting agitated, hearing them laughing and having a good time.
They are all in this house and I'm in the garden, slagging me off nice and proper. My suffering is so funny, apparently. I'm gonna kick off nice and proper when they come out. Then we'll see who's laughing.
After a few more drinks, Sam and Chris decided to call it a night and went to leave the house.
Samantha Stobbard and Christopher Brown came out of that address in Burtley in the early hours of the morning, where they were immediately confronted by Raoul Moat. Without warning, he shot Christopher Brown, shot him a second time, and then he followed him onto a grassed area where Christopher had staggered and fell to the ground, and shot him a third time as he lay, wounded and defenceless. Then turned the gun on Samantha, shooting through the window of the address, causing her critical injuries.
Following the shootings, Moat ran off into the night. Apart from being spotted briefly on CCTV, he disappeared, leaving carnage in his wake.
I knew Raoul was a nutter, but I didn't think he was capable. I didn't think he would do something like that, but he's that sort of person to be capable to get a hold of weapons and stuff like that, but I just didn't think he would actually kill someone.
Why he did it was he would never allow Sam to be with anyone else. I mean, I never in a million years thought he would ever kill anybody, maybe threaten them, but not shoot them. It was just such a shock. And then for him to shoot Samantha as well, that just, I just couldn't believe it. He said himself, the only reason he shot her where he shot her, so she couldn't wear a bikini and show other men a figure. That was typical Raoul. Nobody else was allowed to look at Samantha.
This is the scar where they had to cut open to check my organs, because obviously the bullet hit through my organs and damaged a lot of them.
As Samantha recovered in hospital and mourned her dead boyfriend, Raoul Moat had gone to ground. But the police were quick to identify him as the prime suspect in the shootings.
It was very, very quickly known to us that Raoul Moat was the man responsible. Officers who were attending that scene were getting told very quickly Raoul Moat was responsible for this.
As the police launched their murder investigation, on the Saturday night, Moat broke cover and visited an old friend, Andy McAllister, who had been watching the events in Burtley unfold on TV.
It was a Saturday night, the North East News on Saturday night. We were 10:30, 11:15. And it's mentioned a shooting in Gateshead, and I was watching it, and it brought his picture on the telly. And I knew he had getting out of the jail on a Thursday. And within less than 2 minutes, there was a knock at the door, and it was Raoul. And then he shot me, son.
One of the shootings linked to Moat.
He come in, he had a paper in his hand. He explained what he'd done. He said, look, I'm sorry, but I've done this, Andy. I'll phone the police now. I said, I'll phone it. It's a crime of passion, mate. You've been pushed over the top. I said, we'll get you handed in. As a crime of passion, mate, you'll not get much. Maybe he's 8, 10 years.
Moat had no intention of handing himself in. He left Andy McAllister's house, and at 12:27 a.m, he called the police.
This is the gunman from Burtley last night. My name is Raoul Moat. What I'm phoning about is to tell you exactly why I've done what I've done.
The investigation took a significant escalation on the Saturday night with a phone call from Raoul Moat claiming responsibility for the shooting of Christopher Brown, but more worryingly declaring effective war on Northumbria Police because it was his belief that Christopher Brown was a police officer.
Now, my girlfriend has been having an affair behind my back, but one of your officers, this gentleman that I shot last night, the karate instructor.
He perceived that Northumbria Police were harassing him and were picking on him, so this was his way of taking his revenge. And unfortunately, within minutes of that call, he then approached and shot David Rathband.
PC David Rathband, a traffic officer for Northumbria Police, had one of the best records in the force.
Well, David's actually my younger brother, but you'd think he was my big brother. My protector, always looked after, not just me, all of us. He was like the rock, a family man with family values, morals, everything. David was just David.
He said to me that he felt sometimes he had a criminal mind, and that's why it made him a good cop. But he was a good-natured person, so obviously, you know, he wanted to nail the bad guys. And I think he has a profound sense of right or wrong.
After the shooting, it was widely portrayed in the media that PC Rathband was the victim of an unknown assailant. In fact, the officer had crossed paths with Moat before.
The incident took place in March 2009. David pulled over this vehicle, which was pulling into a scrapyard in Blaydon, just on the outskirts of Newcastle. The van driver was Raoul Moat. David says that Raoul Moat failed the attitude test on that day, and the small chit-chat turned to aggressive rants from Moat about anything, from social services to, you know, not being able to see his children, to trying to, you know, earn a crust and the police stopping it. But the significance of David's first meeting with Moat is that he couldn't get Moat out of his head. And David used a phrase to me which, you know, comes back to haunt us. He said, "Moat will come again," and Moat did.
In the early hours of Sunday the 4th of July, David Rathband had parked his patrol car on the junction of the A1 and the A69, just outside Newcastle.
It was a pretty ordinary night in Newcastle, not much happened. David Rathband felt a presence, and the next thing he knew, there was a tink on the glass, and it was Moat. Moat shot him, probably blinded him on the first shot, waited, and as David is trying to bring himself round, Moat shot him again and left him for what Moat thought was for dead. And sometime later, David summoned up the last amount of courage and energy that he had to get on the police radio. One of the officers heard the words, "I've been shot."
I was just told over the phone that he'd been shot. I didn't know where he'd been shot, but I knew it had been some effect on his eyes. But I didn't know exactly where he'd been shot. And all I knew that he was alive. That was it. It was very basic information.
Moments later, ambulances and the police were at the scene, and Moat was fleeing off into Northumberland.
Personally, I took it as an insult. That was a colleague of mine who had been shot doing the job that I've done over and over and over again for a number of years. It could have been any one of us. That was the point that this investigation became from a relatively straightforward murder inquiry to a significant manhunt where public safety, the safety of police officers, became a huge priority and issue for us.
As Moat fled the scene of the shooting, he paid a final visit to Andy McAllister.
I must have been about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. They couldn't find him. And I got knocked at the door, and it was Col. And he said, "Look, he wants you." And he was parked outside. I went out and spoke to him in the car. We talked. And he asked for a phone. He said, "You got a phone I can have?" Because the police just aren't taking it seriously. So I gave him my contract. I had a contract phone. I took my SIM card out and I gave him the phone. And I said then, "How mate, look, let's stop it now. We'll hand it in. We'll get it finished before it gets too far." And he just says, "Not a chance." And he gets a 20-page statement. He says, "I want that handed to the police. I want as much press known about it as possible, because they're not taking it seriously. And he says, no, I'm going to take as many of them out as I can.
Sometime after the shooting, he made a further phone call and again taunting the police. Do you believe me now? Do you believe me now? And claiming responsibility for shooting PC Rathband. And he was clearly quite angry at that stage with Northumbria Police, making it plain that we weren't going to find him, that he was going to take more victims if he had the chance.
Whilst he was on the phone, Moat dropped a bombshell.
Moat made it plain on his second phone call he had 2 hostages, but we had no evidence to suggest who these hostages may be.
In fact, Moat's hostages were actually his accomplices. Carl Ness, and now a second conspirator, Khurram Arwan.
Carl Ness was the man who assisted Moat when he was in prison. I think he lived a bit in awe of Moat. He was quite subservient to him. Arwan was a bit more of a difficult one to sort of line up the association, but what our inquiries revealed was that Arwan was more of an associate of Ness, so that was where the sort of association came together.
By the Sunday morning, police had conclusively linked the shootings of Chris Brown, Samantha Stobbart and David Rathband. Raoul Moat was now officially a wanted man, but he disappeared. Their hunt for the fugitive was about to shift focus to the most unlikely of places. A peaceful market town called Rothbury. Police were in a race against time to stop him before Moat could strike again. They got the breakthrough they needed on Monday the 6th of July, with reports of an armed robbery in the village of Seaton Delaval.
A man walked into the chip shop and threatened the staff and stole £100 at gunpoint. Very quickly, our suspicions were that that was Moat, and this was him breaking cover to get himself some money and some food.
Detectives quickly realised that the car in which Moat was travelling could be the vital clue. They made the decision to ask members of the public to help track down the vehicle.
The decision to go public and ask for public assistance in finding Arwan's vehicle was the breakthrough that led the police inquiry to Rothbury, because a member of the public phoned in early on a Tuesday morning to report that she had seen that car. It was found next to some industrial units just on the edge of Rothbury. As the police were securing the vehicle, the activity was seen by the group. They split up at that point, and Ness and Arwan made their way out onto a main road and started walking away from Rothbury on a main road, where the police helicopter was able to track them, and they were very quickly contained and arrested. I think the real frustration is there. We were very, very close to Raoul Moat at that point.
With Moat's accomplices now in custody, the quiet Northumberland town of Rothbury became front-page news across the country as officers and vehicles from 19 police forces descended on the area.
Rothbury is in the north of the country, it's in Northumberland. We sit within the Coquet Valley, which is quite a remote and sparsely populated area, and Rothbury is the main village stroke market town in the centre of the Coquet Valley.
He was hiding out in thousands and thousands of acres of dense woodland, cliffs, undergrowth, and it was as challenging a terrain as you could imagine to try and search for somebody. Not just search for somebody who may be lost, but search for somebody who's hiding from you and who's armed and wants to kill you.
When the Manhunt moved to Rothbury, I think everyone in the town was stunned. They'd never seen anything like this. Very quickly, a normal week in the summer was ruined by armed police arriving in the town.
There was armed police officers brought in from right across the UK. There was vehicles provided by the police service in Northern Ireland, all to be deployed in the hunt for Raoul Moat and the protection of the public in and around Rothbury and Northumberland.
Specialist search teams, supported by armed police and sniper units, began combing the wilderness surrounding Rothbury for any evidence of the fugitive gunman.
Very quickly we were able to identify the remains of a campsite, which was clearly the campsite that these guys had been hiding in. We were able to recover some interesting evidence from there. We were able to link the tent that was from there back to one that Ness had bought in B&Q on the Friday evening. But significantly, there was a dictaphone where Moat had verbalised his thoughts, his accounts, his excuses for shooting these people and killing Christopher Brown. But the more worrying and sinister part was he had also verbalised his intention to turn on the public.
This had come about by details of his personal life being exposed. And I think it was reporting about his mother and things that his mother had said about him that really tipped him over the edge. And he said at this time that for every inaccurate thing he read in the papers or anything that upset him that he saw or heard, he would harm a member of the public.
I'm gonna get the lot of yous. I've just been listening to the fucking radio and all. What a bunch of tossers.
One of the ways that we could prevent that from happening was to get the media to temper the reporting, particularly around Moat himself, Moat the individual. That was the bits he clearly didn't like.
All newspapers, television and radio were told they could report the manhunt, but we all signed an agreement saying that we wouldn't report anything about Moat's personal life.
With the risks so high, the media complied with the police's requests, and reporting of Moat's personal life was now off limits. The manhunt, however, continued to be the lead story on news programmes and front pages up and down the country, with journalists adding to the drama that was unfolding.
The language that the media used, I think, was very revealing about the way in which the whole story was represented and understood.
The police say the net is tightening.
So Raoul Moat was referred to by the media as being Britain's most wanted man.
Britain's most wanted man, murder suspect Raoul Moat.
7 days to find the most wanted man in Britain.
The media talked about Rothbury being a town under siege. They talked about Rothbury being in lockdown.
At 2 o'clock, the local middle school went into lockdown.
It also relies very heavily on fictional representations of crime. Here we had a kind of outlaw gunman on the loose in the countryside.
He says he won't be taken alive. The stakes in this search have never been higher.
This is something that we're probably more used to seeing from Hollywood movies or American TV shows. And the language and the whole representation of the events by the media reflected that kind of narrative of what was happening.
What was a murder investigation and a manhunt, and the search for a very dangerous man had taken on a life of its own, and in a sort of entertainment way by this point. There were reports that Paul Gascoigne had come up to see him, and that Gazza had been a friend of Moat and they'd known each other from when Moat was working in the town, and Gazza had been going to pubs and clubs.
Paul Gascoigne had indeed made the trip to Rothbury, but in fact was stopped at a police cordon well outside the town. He later stated he was unaware of the severity of Moat's crimes.
It was strange because obviously these are such tragic events, and suddenly there was a strange comic side to it that Paul Gascoigne had become involved.
Despite the frenzied media coverage, there was no doubt in the police's mind quite how serious the situation in Rothbury was becoming. Moat was armed, threatening to kill innocent people, and was on the loose in thousands of acres of wilderness.
This was probably the most dangerous situation that I've ever been involved in. Dangerous for the public in terms of the threat. We had clear, declared intent by this individual to harm members of the public or members of Northumbria Police.
Raoul Moat very much led police on a chase around this large amount of countryside. He was moving around and he was being followed, but he was just moving out of the police's reach all the time.
One of the sightings was that he'd been seen up near the middle school. I believe they'd potentially found a mobile phone up there that had put him within that area, and I think there was an immediate concern. If he's in that area, let's ensure that the school children are safe. There were officers stationed all the way around the building. If he was in that area, he certainly wasn't getting anywhere near that school.
The reports of Moat near the school turned out to be a false alarm. To the residents of Rothbury, though, it was just another example of how unreal the situation in their town was becoming.
A lot of residents said to me that when they were watching the news in the evening and they saw the police searching cars and there was police officers stationed on the bridge and at the entrances and exits to Rothbury, it was hard to believe that this was happening half a mile away within our own village. It was like a different world. It was like something you would see in London or in one of the major cities, not in a small village in rural Northumberland. It's not something that happens every day.
The hunt for Moat continued until Friday the 9th of July. Then, at around 7 p.m, Moat was spotted emerging from the woods that surrounded the town.
He'd lain low there for a number of days. He had no access to food or water other than what he could find in the forest. It had been pretty wet on and off, and I just think there gets to a stage where any human being has had enough.
He had his gun in his hand. He was lying there. It felt like everything was against him by that point.
From my investigation, it became quite clear that he was pretty suicidal. When we searched his house, we found a noose that was already in place in the loft, and we found a number of suicide notes to friends and associates. So here was a man that was clearly contemplating taking his own life, and even up to his phone calls to the police, he was claiming that he wouldn't be taken alive.
He mentioned something about not having a father, which was some of the last words that we know he said, and how the root cause of all this was his poor family relationships and his the lack of a father figure in his life.
Just after midnight, 6 hours into the standoff, and with the weather deteriorating, negotiators reported a change in Moat's behaviour.
Moat's demeanour changed slightly, and he moved the gun to a different position. They could tell that something was going to happen. In a split second, you had 2 officers firing their taser weapons, and you had negotiators shouting at him to put his gun down. The mood changed. He made the decision and he pulled the trigger.
The critically injured gunman was rushed to hospital, but doctors couldn't save him. Moat died later that morning. His death, however, did not mark the end of the story. The subsequent trial of his accomplices would reveal bizarre facts that would shock the nation. Worse still, and with a complete lack of respect for his victims, Moat would be mourned by some as a hero.
At the beginning of 2011, Moat's accomplices stood trial at Newcastle Crown Court. A variety of charges, including conspiracy to murder Chris Brown and the attempted murder of David Rathband.
I think it was important that Ness and Joanne were brought to justice because Moat couldn't have done this on his own. He needed the help. He needed somebody to help him source the gun when he was in prison. He needed somebody to try and help him find out what Samantha was doing. So for me, it was really important that those that helped him were brought to justice.
It became strange that these 2 characters had been prepared to help Moat carry out such horrific crimes. And, you know, they're seen laughing and joking in the aisles of Tesco, buying things like sauce as if they were going to a barbecue.
To hear the witnesses who were passed off as hostages, they'd written letters saying, "I'm safer than safe." They'd gone shopping for chicken wraps in Subway. When they robbed the chippy in Seaton Delaval, Moat supposedly shouted, "Wonga!" They were a few miles away at the McDonald's, and a police car pulled up, and one of the accomplices said something to the effect of, "Do we want to do him?" And the other said, "No, let Raoul finish his McFlurry." All these bizarre details.
The evidence against both men was pretty overwhelming. CCTV featured hugely, particularly in terms of Joanne. Although Joanne claimed that he was a hostage, we have numerous pieces of CCTV where he's gone out and did the shopping for Raoul Moat. So the evidence was quite overwhelming in that sense, and the jury agreed.
Carl Ness was found guilty of murdering Christopher Brown and the attempted murder of Samantha Stobbart. Both he and Khurram Awan were also found guilty of several other charges, including the attempted murder of David Rathband. The sentences handed down reflected the severity of their crimes.
Both got life sentences. One got a minimum recommendation to serve 20 years, and Ness got a minimum recommendation to serve 40 years.
The culmination of the trial seemingly drew a line under the Raoul Moat saga, with those affected by his actions satisfied that, at least in part, justice had been done.
When they read the verdict, the best part of a year's worth of emotion, I think, clearly freed itself from David's soul, and guilty, guilty, without a shadow of a doubt, all of them.
Throughout the manhunt, and especially after its violent end, pages on various social media sites began to appear. While many condemned Moat for his actions, a few confounded public opinion by portraying him as a hero.
I think in the immediate aftermath, there were concerns raised about the glamorization of Raoul Moat. There were, media stories about people visiting the site where he died. There were stories about Facebook groups being set up to celebrate Raoul Moat. He was clearly not a man who deserved to be glamorized in those ways whatsoever.
He was, to some, like a Robin Hood figure. He was making a stand for the normal man against the police. Children were going around singing a song that went something like, Raoul Moat is the man, he'll catch the coppers when he can. The fact that he was a murderer had sort of escaped some people.
He'd murdered one person and shot at 2 other people. There was nothing heroic about it. There was certainly nothing to glorify.
One of the things about extreme behaviour is that it generates extreme reactions. There were certainly people who were keen to idolise Raoul Moat. I think the question for us as a society is what do we make of that? Why is that happening?
Incredibly, even a year after the standoff, floral tributes would still appear at the scene of Moat's death, much to the anger of local residents.
It's not something that we as a community want to mark in any way, shape or form. It's a chapter in our history that we want to put behind us and move on from. We don't want to be reminded of it.
As the family of Christopher Brown mourned his death, Samantha Stubbart, permanently scarred by Moat, was released from hospital to rebuild her life. PC David Rathband carried on his personal battle with his injuries. Completely blinded by Moat's shotgun, he set up the Blue Lamp Foundation, a charity to raise money to help emergency service personnel injured in the line of duty.
PC David Rathband pretty much amazed everyone in the weeks, days and weeks after the shooting. He came out very quickly stating his intention to return to the police force, which I think everyone was amazed by.
David had this public persona, and he was happy to be in the limelight, to keep the case in the memory, to raise money for his charity. But behind closed doors, his life was stress and trauma, and people didn't see that.
On the evening of Wednesday, the 29th of February, 2012, David Rathband was found dead at his home. He had committed suicide.
It's like anybody, isn't it? You just wish you'd had one last conversation that meant something. The last conversation we had was, are you all right? Yeah, I'm fine. You're not all right, are you? No, I'm fine. And, days later, that was the end. And, he's the first person close to me that I've ever lost. And he transferred many of his emotions to me, and that will never leave me. I would do it all again because he's an incredible guy. Incredible guy.
Being close to David and seeing the real David and the real struggles and his day-to-day life, what he'd been left with, no, I wasn't surprised. I was heartbroken, but I wasn't surprised. I didn't blame David. I couldn't be cross with him because I understood. He's still here. He's in my heart, and he always will be. And I will talk about him.
In 2016, the family of David Rathband lost to civil action after filing a negligence claim against Northumbria Police. In the aftermath of the events in Rothbury, the Independent Police Complaints Commission conducted a thorough inquiry into the death of Raoul Moat, ultimately endorsing police actions in the standoff.
It's easily the biggest policing operation I've been involved in. The force was able to rise to that challenge. I think about the victims. I think about Christopher Brown. I think about Dave Rathband. I think the big thing for me was nobody else got hurt. Despite Moat's intentions, nobody else got hurt.